Today was my very favorite day of the month because today was Drawing Bee Day. And I want to share with you what that is, what we were drawing for this month's Drawing Bee, and a very beautiful parallel between the content we were drawing and the process of drawing it, and how both of those are so key to this. Is it a myth? Is it a lesson? Is it a what? What is it? What it is that somehow when we're making something, we're trying to do something, we have this expectation that if it doesn't come out of us fully formed, we're a failure. And you might hear that and think that's ridiculous. And you might hear that and go, wow, yeah, I do have that expectation of myself. That's an unrealistic expectation. I say it from experience. The inner perfectionist. The inner critic, very loud. And my particular inner critic doesn't tell me I can't do things. My inner critic says I have to do them absolutely impeccably. And we don't even come out of our mothers fully formed. So that expectation that if something doesn't come out fully formed, it's a failure, is not fair to any of us. So what was so brilliant was not only was that reflected in the content we drew for the Drawing Bee, it was also part of our process in drawing the Drawing Bee. So let me tell you what a Drawing Bee is, aside from my favorite day of the month. In my online community, Loose Tooth Studio, we have a monthly Drawing Bee. And first, this is just a date with yourself and a date with each other to at least practice your visual thinking once a month. Life gets in the way, at least you've got this monthly practice, this Drawing Bee, to make a drawing and to show up with each other for an incredibly rich conversation. And part of the reason I love teaching what I teach, which is visual thinking, is that it is exactly the right tools to let ourselves not be fully formed, right? It's like these are the tools that let us figure stuff out, push stuff around, to be messy, to be squishy, to have that space, to just have that process that's going to get us to a better finished product, that's going to get us to something amazing. But so many of us set that really high bar, and when we don't meet it, we don't do anything, right? And we beat ourselves up and all that. So not only is so visual thinking in itself is a fantastic tool to shut up that inner critic, to figure stuff out. And what we do is we practice, we get online together. It is a complex skill set. It takes time to learn. I will never say there's a magic pill to learn visual thinking, because there is not. I absolutely make it as breaking it down into bite-sized pieces, teaching it in a very clear path, and it's still complex. So the closest we get, I'm still not going to call it a magic pill, the closest we get to like the secret sauce is the Drawing Bee, because that not only have we all shown up doing the same work, literally drawing the same content, what we learn about ourselves and about each other, and how when we learn from each other in this conversation we have, it is incredible how much farther, how much faster we each get in our individual practice because of what we do on my favorite day of the month in the Drawing Bee. So today's Drawing Bee, the piece of content we were drawing, I wanted to draw it because I had heard about this study years ago, found it fascinating. So one, I just wanted to make a drawing of it and wanted to put it on my blog so people could find it, or I could point people towards it, and more people could know about the study. And I did really absolutely believe that it was just good content for my studio mates. Like I thought folks would appreciate it, and they did. And it turned out to have this beautiful parallel with the content and the process. And I thought there was something else I was going to say. We're going to let it go. We're going to get a little messy. Now, this study, years ago on Fresh Air, Terry Gross interviewed two doctors who were doing a study about stress responses in kids. And when I say that, you think that sounds nefarious. But one of the things they did was they would drop a drop of lemon juice on a child's tongue and record their cortisol levels and their changes in heartbeat and breathing rate, autonomic nervous system reactions to these particular stressors, one being a drop of lemon juice on their tongue. And in their studies, they found there were two types of kids. There was the kids who had a very low reaction, so not much changes in their stress response, and the other kids who were highly reactive to the stress response. And in this conversation with Terry Gross, in their studies, they call these two types of responses, these two types of kids, the kids who have the very low stress response are dandelions. Wherever you grow them, they'll be fine. The kids who have the high stress response, they called orchids. I called up my sister and I said, "You are a dandelion." And she didn't appreciate it. She is a wonderful, beautiful flower, and happily she is more of the dandelion, and her older sister is an orchid. And interestingly, while the low stress response kids had generally positive long-term health outcomes, the highly reactive kids had the very best health outcomes and the very worst health outcomes. So they were studying this and trying to figure out, what does this mean? And the idea is the orchids, if the orchids have the right conditions, they not only thrive, they excel. If they're in the right greenhouse, they can do remarkable things. Great health outcomes, fantastic health outcomes. And if they don't have that right environment, they get the worst outcomes. So what blew my mind about hearing about this years ago was, I was the orchid raised in a lousy greenhouse until I grew up and could create my own beautiful greenhouse where I got to teach visual thinking for a living and work and take care of this particular orchid. And it very much was a great metaphor, a great explanation of the huge differences between my sister and I. And we love each other very much. And like a quote from today's content, no two kids are raised in the same family. Like, huge differences between our experiences as the two kids in this nuclear family. So that's the content I wanted us to draw. I chose, instead of the fresh air interview, I found this interview, a podcast episode from the Art of Manliness podcast. The host is named Brett. Forgive me, Brett. I will put your full name below and a link to the episode. Fantastic interview with W. Thomas Boyce, one of these two doctors I had heard years ago on Fresh Air. So that was our content we drew. It was about 35 minutes talking about this study, talking about what I just described. And another aspect of drawing bees is not only that we have the monthly practice and we have this conversation. Every month I record a walkthrough video where I walk you exactly through how I made my drawing, my drawing of our shared content. And usually I start with a blank sheet of paper, start recording, and it comes out fully formed. It comes out fully formed because I've got a lifetime experience with this. That's why I teach what I teach. That's why I love to make these spaces for us to develop these skills. This month, because yesterday this orchid was having a horrible time, and because it was a longer piece of content and just looking at how I could show up and be present today live for the drawing bee, instead of this, last night, as this orchid was taking care of herself and had a cat on her lap and listened to this episode, I made a rough draft. Not the first time I've done this. I do this plenty, but I don't know how often I've done it in this context of the drawing bee. So last night, in the 35 minutes with the cat on my lap, Stamp in this case, Stamp the cat, this is what I drew. And I did make some general decisions around how I thought I might want the drawing to be laid out and just captured content. So this let me be messy. This was just getting something down, not fully formed. Again, this is not the first time I've done it. I just don't usually take use this process, take this approach in the particular context of the drawing bees. And what was great was not only was I taking care of the orchid and being kind to myself, I was also getting this nice breather between making this drawing and making the next drawings. Also the sleep on it factor. So I drew this last night, and then first thing today, the next step, the next iteration, was drawing a couple thumbnails. So if I zoom, I'll say, no, we're not going to worry about the details there. That's what the drawing bee was for, the walkthrough, or the call and the walkthrough. So next, I made a couple thumbnails because I will say this. When you talk about a dandelion and an orchid, very natural way to approach the page is half the page is going to be dandelion, half the page is going to be orchid. That was not the case in the podcast episode. Far more of the conversation was around the orchids. So one thing I knew I wanted to do was change the proportion. So here I've got a dandelion, here I've got that thriving orchid, and I've got the wilting orchid. And I will show you just a little bit of like the level of, polish, really rough sketches. This is my handwriting for myself. This is crossing stuff out, trying to connect things any which way. So in this first iteration, I got down the content I wanted. I had some rough shape, but I knew I needed that shape to change. So now, the next morning, I made this thumbnail where I was changing the proportions of what I was drawing. So far more orchid side, same general shape, wanted to create this root system of talking about epigenetics over in this corner. I wanted to use this acronym of orchid during the conversation. I wanted to be next to the orchid. Then I realized I didn't want it to be next to the orchid because I wanted to use that stem as a way to organize some of the points within this particular interview. So we went from, may not look like a big difference, but thumbnail number 1, thumbnail number 2, and then I made my drawing. And that looks like this. And I'll back up so you can see, nope, that's the wrong direction. Nurturing, nurturing, nurturing. Good thing to zoom in on. That's a worthy zoom in. So let's see. This was the drawing, which was partially done before the call because my greenhouse continued to be very weird. And that's okay. So this is the complete drawing, which I finished after our drawing bee. But in the drawing bee, we had this conversation about our drawings. And it was wonderful to see how much similarity there were in our drawings, across our drawings, and always interesting differences in our decisions. One thing that was what looped back so beautifully to the content was how in the drawing bee calls, we get to hear how somebody else is viewing what we've done. But inside, we've had our experience of making the drawing. So in our experience of making the drawing, the inner critic has said what they had to say. We've written something weird or misspelled something, or, oh, heck, most folks first wanted to do half the drawings dandelions, half the drawings orchids. So that was not only my experience, a lot of us did that, which makes a lot of sense. And then we went, that's not the proportion of dandelions to orchids in the content. So we talked about, who changed that, who didn't change that, how we adapted as we made our drawings. So inherently, there was, well, not inherently, but many of us made a decision that we wanted to shift. So it did not come out fully formed because it wasn't this equal sides dandelion to orchid. Next, one thing that was what I loved about making this first was, and because I was doing it in this context where we're talking out loud, sharing our process, was, yeah, one thing that's really great about doing this first is when I then grab a blank sheet of paper, I can step back, look at this piece of paper, and say, what is the first most important thing for me to draw? Now, that first most important thing to draw is both because it is a key concept in the content, like the content itself is important, and also what's important to draw in the order we're drawing things in a drawing. In this particular case, not surprisingly, the first thing I drew was this shape of this pot, the dandelion, and I think I just started out with the stems. Just wanted to get the kind of movement of the stems and the right proportions on the page. And then, what's the next important thing to put in this drawing? Right? So now that I have all the content I want in this drawing on this piece of paper, now I can prioritize in a way I can't prioritize when I'm doing it all in one draft. That's just the deal. Like that is just a difference in process leading into a different type of thinking, a different way we can organize our thinking, because this is the stuff. Now I've got all the stuff down. In the next iteration, again, I can make choices differently. My organizational choices are inherently different because I let myself be messy in the first place. So then it was, what was the next most important thing? I wanted to add these names: dandelion, orchid, thrives in any environment, highly reactive. So again, creating these parallels, even if more of the page is orchid than dandelion. And then just keep on going from there. And then it was a matter of what is on this piece of paper that I don't want to be in this drawing. So, that was a couple really great questions that came from the studio mates today. Lisa asked the question of, where do you put the title? Like, how do you prioritize the title? And was she the same, Lisa? Another question was, what did you choose not to put in the drawing? I think that question might have been Andrea. So really great process questions, right? Like when you're thinking about how to prioritize something in the moment, how do you make these decisions? So, in the drawings on the shared board, we could answer, an answer to Lisa's question was what we could see in the drawings. Another layer of that answer was the conversation we had about how we chose to write or not write the title of the episode versus the core thesis statement of the study versus, in my case, it was more these two phrases and the best and worst health outcomes. And again, if I'm remembering correctly, to answer, have our own answers to Andrea's question about what did you decide not to put in the drawing? Because definitely there's a point where I'm looking at this, I'm looking what I've taken from here, what I've put in here, and what isn't worth being in this drawing. And sometimes that's because, I've just decided this is the right level of detail for what I want this drawing to be, which in this case, this is practice, but we can always use the lens of, is this for my own learning? Is this for another audience? So our objective may be different from drawing to drawing, and that help you prioritize what should be in this drawing. Also, there is just the aesthetics of how much information can I fit on this page that isn't, before it becomes too much, before it becomes much harder. There's cognitive overload looking at this drawing. Whether you're navigating it for yourself again, and certainly if anyone else is looking at it. But here is the loop back. So not only are we talking about how we're formed, so here these stress responses, turns out it's all the way from, they were studying kids who were 4 to 8 years old, but they were noticing the changes in infancy, at birth, in utero, and even with epigenetics, generational changes. What? And they were studying how their stress response impacted them either this direction with the best outcomes or here with the worst outcomes throughout their life. So we're not fully formed either here, and very much a huge part of this study was not you're either this or you're that this is good and this is bad. That was not the case. It's this is one type of response, here's another type of response. And we learned that in this kind of response, this happens for these reasons, or this happens when there isn't these supports. So here we've got what's the difference between this and this? Very broad generalization from this particular podcast episode that big factors in thriving and excelling is being nurtured and things being predictable. That your greenhouse is stable and it's the right conditions for you as the orchid. And if they're instead in an environment of adversity and uncertainty, here's where you get the worst health outcomes. So we're not fully formed as human beings. And also this idea that, yes, there are things happening genetically, but a huge, huge, huge factor in this is your environment and your experience, and how cultivating the right environment for you, especially when you are an orchid who might be more sensitive, have different reactions, how you shape your environment and what your experiences are and the meaning you make from your experiences. So isn't that just the best? So again, love this, love this idea, love that, well, one, just love the process, this iterative process where the process of practice and sharing our practice and how we go farther faster together because we're working together. But truly, anytime we let ourselves make the messy drawing, let ourselves be a mess, let ourselves figure something out. And again, how it was so beautifully paralleled with the content itself. So that's a little bit of the story of the drawing you'll see below, or the link to the blog with the drawing below the video. I hope you found this interesting, both in the content itself. So I will link to the original Fresh Air interview. I'll link to Brett's The Art of Manliness episode. I'll link to Boyce's TEDx talk, which was also super fascinating, coming from a totally different angle. So if you're curious, it'd be really interesting to listen to the same topic told in these 3 different ways. Boyce's TEDx talk, way more research forward. In the Fresh Air interview, if I remember correctly, the entry point was more telling the story of his own differences between he and his sister. And then in the Art of Manliness interview with Brett, it really started with this broader idea of, we notice these 2 things and the dandelions thrive, but the orchids either excelled, had the absolute best outcomes, or the worst outcomes, and what did that mean? How did that happen? So it really started out with that bigger picture topic, and then they had this wonderful path through more of the detail in the study, in the results. So thank you for watching. I appreciate your time. Hope that was interesting process-wise. If it isn't, sorry, I'm a process person. If it isn't interesting to you, you're probably not going to sign up for Loose Tooth Studio and join me on Drawing Bees. If nothing else, I hope you found the study interesting. So thank you so much for watching. I welcome questions. I welcome comments. If it's on YouTube, you can add comments. If it's on my blog, you can always drop me an email. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for letting me share the story of the drawing bee, letting me share this study of dandelion children and orchid children. As an orchid child, I appreciate the space to orchid out and get to share my process with you. So thanks so much for watching.